Hi, my name is Mike Lynch. I'm going to be doing a book review of Bias by Dr. Emberhart and trying to do it in 5 minutes or less. So, and I apologize for the lighting behind me. So, chapter one, she describes how race shapes who we are, and and this is the question she wants to answer throughout the book. How does race shape who we are? And race, as it turns out, could be has an influence over our brain's most basic functions. Chapter two she talks about categorization and how our brain categorizes things just automatically. We categorize everything, including food and animals, and this creates stereotypes, maybe even unknowingly we stereotype, labeling social groups, which can result in prejudice. So she talks about confirmation bias and happens when we seek out information that validates our beliefs. In chapter three, um, she talks about how if it's our perceptions that can be hijacked by our racial biases, or can race exert an influence on our behavior and in particular a person's decision to pull a trigger on a gun, which was a study they did, and they found that the study showed that the participants pressed shoot quicker when there was a gun present than when there was no gun present, and they were to press don't when they wanted to press don't shoot. They also found that race was a factor. So they would respond to shoot more quickly when a black person was holding a gun versus a white person. So, which leads to chapter four, which focuses on police bias towards African Americans specifically. And kind of the idea was that they hear all day long that black male is going over the radio, which solidifies the pairing of black people and crime. And this kind of was disturbing. And made the question, and there was a police officer in particular that realized he was doing this, and he said it was disturbing him because it questioned his whole philosophy as to why he became a police officer to begin with, because he didn't realize that he was automatically creating this bias based off of what he kind of heard over the radio all the time. So chapter five, she talks about statistics involving black people and cops, such as black drivers getting pulled over when they are twice as likely than white drivers to be stopped for a high discretion equipment violation as opposed to a moving violation. Um, so kind of like the role of police and how they use that bias to maybe pull over black people versus white people, and how they treat black people as a result. Chapter six kind of leads into chapter six, which talks about the historical framework for bias that was established a long time ago through psychology and other things. Uh, Kind of the study was showing that the subliminal drawing of an ape illustration or a bias is driven by notions that we already carry. So people associate the drawing that they showed of an ape with like a black. They call it, as a result, the black ape association became prevalent. Even if it's an unconscious one, people they were seeing that trend in their studies. Chapter seven, um, she talked about segregated space and the public institutions that conspired to keep blacks and whites in separate living areas, which is kind of leads into systemic racism that we see not only in the police force but just in general in society. Chapter eight, she talked about um, kind of the logic of the 1950s, that racism was a result of ignorance as opposed to, which is I think partly true, but then they attempted to overcome this by providing opportunities for black uh, people to be kind of integrated or close contact with whites. And there were some positive results, but unfortunately, integration in schools, for example, didn't accomplish the goal of equality. It actually determined that white people spent more time in the group that they are biased against. If they do that, it can reinforce a stereotype they already carry. So, chapter nine, a lot of this chapter is devoted to the Charlottesville um, protest and the marching of the neo Nazis, and kind of the fallout in Charlottesville as a result, um, of that incident. And then finally, in chapter 10, she talks about uses the example of the Starbucks incident in Philadelphia, where the two black men were arrested for trespassing when they weren't doing anything except waiting for another business partner. And kind of the idea that there's this systemic racism happens to it kind of just as an example, kind of what Starbucks did to overcome that by starting to have integrated into their training bias, overcoming bias training and stuff. And then, sorry, that was my alarm for 5 minute mark. And then at the end of the book, she wanted to stress that overcoming bias has to start with people believing it can be overcome. And so the overall message of the book being like, there are all these problems that we face in our society of bias and stereotypes and racism, systemic racism and unconscious bias or implicit bias and all these things, but that it's not hopeless, that there's a way to overcome it if we believe we can. So that's the summary of the chapters. I don't really have time to reflect too much, but I will say that this book was very eye-opening for me and did influence how I do view the world now, in just more self-reflection than anything else, because all the statistics and everything was kind of disgusting, I would say, for lack of a better way to say it. But it also made me stop and think about how I view the world, which I think was kind of the point. So again, apologize for the video quality, and I went a little over on time. Thank you so much, and that is all.